Thank you. This presentation is actually from an article that's hopefully going, touch wood, to be in East European politics on a special issue of authoritarian learning. I'm fortunate enough to have had two wonderful presentations that have largely given the background already on authoritarian learning, so there's no further need to go into detail on that, and also on pre-2000 Belarus. So again, there's no need to go into detail on what happens in the lead-up, and also with the economy, which was already touched on earlier in the questions that Yulia faced. So again, there's no need to talk about that. So what I'm going to do is, if I can use this properly, is talk about the synopsis of the actual argument of the article. The current literature, I don't know if any of you are aware, on authoritarian learning, is largely, well actually not largely, almost entirely focused on Russia. That Russia, which has the wealth, has the resources, and is there to promote, bolster, act as a black knight to others, and with its diffusion of authoritarian ideas and its linkage and leverage with other states, particularly in the former Soviet Union, it is the promoter of authoritarianism in that region. However, it's something that's annoyed me quite a bit, having read Vitaly Solitsky, the late Vitaly Solitsky's work on Belarus as a testing ground for authoritarian learning, that Belarus has been missed in this literature. And I wanted to ascertain whether there was actually a case for a Belarusian preventative revolution textbook, whether Belarus did just implement Russian ideas as a testing ground, or whether it actually devised its own tactics and methods that it then developed. This was primarily the synopsis of the actual argument, that the Belarusian regime has, to an extent, taught the Kremlin certain ideas, that we can actually talk about a Belarusian preventative textbook that does sort of exist, the methods that were primarily developed by Lukashenko, by the KGB, and by the Belarusian regime. And we can also talk about Belarus not just being a testing ground and lesson drawing venue for Russia, but actually developing certain tactics and methods that the Kremlin then said, okay, that looks great, we'll think about using that in Russia. My argument begins in 2000 with the Bulldozer revolution in Belgrade. I don't want to go into too much detail. I'm sure that we know what happened in Belgrade in 2000 with the first colour revolution. It led eventually to the demise of Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade. And one of the great quotes of that revolution was, "Today Milosevic, tomorrow Lukashenko." And Lukashenko, the Belarusian regime, decided, oh, this might be a bit of a problem, especially with the 2001 presidential elections coming up. The importance of youth groups that had existed, the importance of civil society being able to get out and show the world primarily that the Serbian regime had used tremendous amounts of electoral fraud to win Milosevic the vote. And so the Belarusian regime started to draw lessons from Belgrade. One should also remember that Milosevic and Lukashenko were allegedly very good friends and did spend a lot of time together. I believe the Belarusian regime did at one point try to sell weapons to Serbia, although that might be open to conjecture. So what was actually found? Well, the preventative revolution begins almost straight away. That you have new media laws that occur in 2001, 2002 and 2003, which further restricts media independence. DDoS, denial of, the DDoS stand for, for IT. Denial of services acts, I think is DDoS. Yeah, were begun against the opposition much earlier than actually occurred in the Kremlin. Media laws from Russia started in 2003 after the Rose Revolution in Georgia, but really took off after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. At the same time, the Belarusian regime decided it needed an ideology. Schools and universities students were instructed in this ideology. I use the term loosely because it's I'm unable to really tell you what the ideology actually was. It just seemed to be a way for Lukashenko to maintain his position and legitimacy with the wider public. It was a way to promote Belarusian, or rather the regime, to the younger population and get them as far away from youth groups such as Pora in Ukraine and Kamara in Georgia, and Zhub in Belarus. The Kremlin, by its own volition, began its own concept of ideology, primarily sovereign democracy, which first originated by Vladislav Surkov in 2005. And after the protests in 2011 and 2012, the Kremlin has again become more conservative. Whether this was actually taken from Belarus is open to debate. You also have the Belarusian Republican Youth Union, or what I would term the Lukmol, which started in 2003 from a meeting of two youth groups that were already pro-Lukashenko in Minsk, and they became the Belarusian Republican Youth Union as a means to, again, bring Belarusian youth together for the regime. And the obvious connotation is that Nashi started in 2004 and then really wrote its first pamphlet about its stance in 2005, which was, or seemed to be, the same idea of the Belarusian Youth Union, protecting the regime, defending the squares, promoting, in Nashi's case, Russian culture and the Kremlin's own ideology. One could also argue that the Lukmol was largely ineffectual. Having spoken with a lecturer at McGimo in Moscow, he was very condescending about how effective the Lukmol actually was. That the Russian regime obviously had the resources to be able to go out and get the best people into Nashi and give them access to universities and the latest iPhone and things like that, whereas most university students in Belarus apparently did not actually know they were members of the Belarusian Republican Youth Union until graduation, when they were told they had to pay. So this is, so in some respects, I would argue the Kremlin learned how the Belarusian Republican Youth Union worked and how effective or ineffective it was. Other legislation did occur in regards to non-governmental organisations, or NGOs. In 2001 and 2003, we see not so much the idea of foreign agents, but certainly the presence of foreign NGOs working with Belarusian NGOs was strictly prohibited. This predates Russian legislation of 2006. This is an open question, I freely admit, about the idea of gongos. From what I found, gongos, thank you, seem to exist in Belarus in 2003. However, there is some argument that Civic Forum, or Civic Platform, had been in existence in Russia since 2000, and if that's a gongo, it's open to some debate. I'm willing to discuss this later. The Belarusian regime also learned by itself from what happened in the 2006 protests to how the 2010 TAP protests were quickly stopped. In 2006, the opposition, to an extent, had managed to get a few tents on squares in Minsk, but in 2010 that was stopped straight away. In the 2007 March of Dissenters in Moscow and St. Petersburg did copy certain, Vladimir Gelman euphemistically says new tactics or new methods that, without going into any detail as to where these new methods had occurred from. But there was small demonstrations in 2006 which the Kremlin had used tactics that they had devised from 2003 and 2004, but the 2007 march was very different, very, very restrictive and coerced for the opposition, and so one has to ask the question where they actually developed and got these tactics from. There's also a contention that the Kremlin copied ideas from the 2010 protests in Belarus. Once they had worked out who was Nash, ours, and who was Nash, not ours, they then cracked down very hard, particularly after Bolotnaya on May 6th, I think it was, 2012. In conclusion, I freely admit there is no holy grail. Both regimes are closed black boxes. There hasn't been an accident yet that allows me or anyone else to open them up. I can only really make inferences and deductions from the available data. learning is always hard to measure. In fact, I would say impossible to measure to a great extent. So again, it is only for what they are, inferences. However, I would say that there are strong deductions that Belarus certainly did serve as a testing ground up to and probably including the present day, but certainly after the colour revolutions. And so, like I say, I welcome any questions, and yes, thank you very much.